Vincent Willem van Gogh was born on the 30th of March, 1853, in the village of Groot-Zundert, a small community in the southern Netherlands near the Belgian border. He was the eldest surviving child of Theodorus van Gogh, a Protestant minister serving a modest rural congregation, and Anna Cornelia Carbentus, the daughter of a bookbinder from The Hague. The family was respectable but not wealthy, occupying that particular stratum of Dutch society where education and propriety mattered more than material abundance. Vincent was not born into artistic circles. He was not raised among painters or sculptors. He received no early training in the visual arts, and showed no childhood prodigy in drawing or color. His family's connections lay elsewhere, in religion and in commerce, and it was along these established paths that the young Vincent was expected to find his way. The Van Gogh family had deep roots in two particular trades. On one side, there was the church. Theodorus van Gogh followed his own father into the ministry, and religious devotion shaped the household's daily rhythms, its moral expectations, and its sense of purpose. On the other side, there was the art trade. 3 of Theodorus's brothers had entered the business of selling paintings and prints, and one of them, also named Vincent, had risen to become a partner in Goupil and Company, one of the most prominent art dealers in Europe. This uncle, known within the family as Uncle Sant, represented a different kind of success, one measured in reputation, international connections, and financial security. The young Vincent thus grew up in a household where two very different models of respectable life were constantly present: the contemplative sacrifice of religious service and the worldly sophistication of the art market. Vincent's early years were quiet and largely unremarkable. He attended local schools, learned French and English in addition to Dutch, and developed a habit of solitary walking through the countryside around Groot-Zundert. He was remembered as a serious child, somewhat withdrawn, prone to moods that oscillated between intense engagement and prolonged silence. He did not excel academically, nor did he distinguish himself socially among his peers. When he was 16, in 1869, the family decided that Vincent should begin his working life, and through Uncle Sant's influence, a position was secured for him at the Goupil Gallery in The Hague. This appointment was a significant opportunity. Goupil and Company was not a provincial operation but an international firm with branches in Paris, London, Brussels, and New York. The gallery dealt in original paintings, reproductions, and prints, catering to the growing middle-class appetite for art as domestic decoration and cultural refinement. For a young man from a village parsonage, employment at Goupil offered exposure to the wider world, to cities, to commerce, and to the visual culture of the 19th century. Vincent arrived in The Hague and began learning the trade under the supervision of experienced dealers. He catalogued stock, assisted customers, corresponded with clients, and gradually absorbed the mechanics of how art was valued, marketed, and sold. By most accounts, Vincent performed well during his early years at Goupil. He was diligent, knowledgeable, and capable of forming genuine enthusiasm for the works he handled. He developed particular affection for certain artists and schools, especially the realist painters of the Barbizon tradition and the Dutch masters of earlier centuries. He began visiting museums and private collections, educating his eye and building the visual memory that would later inform his own practice. His letters from this period, primarily addressed to his younger brother Theo, who would eventually follow him into the Goupil firm, reveal a young man earnestly engaged with questions of beauty, meaning, and the moral weight of images. These letters would continue throughout Vincent's life, forming a remarkable archive of his intellectual and emotional development. In 1873, after 4 years in The Hague, Vincent was transferred to the London branch of Goupil. He was 20 years old, and this move represented both a promotion and a challenge. London was vastly larger and more complex than anything he had known. He found lodgings with a widow and her daughter in Brixton, threw himself into exploring the city's museums and galleries, and continued his work at the gallery with apparent success. But something began to shift during his time in London. The letters to Theo, previously focused on art and work, began to take on a different character. Vincent became preoccupied with religion, reading the Bible intensively and attending various church services. He also fell in love, reportedly with his landlady's daughter, Eugenie a lawyer, and this attachment ended badly when his feelings were not returned. The rejection affected him deeply. Those who knew Vincent during this period observed a change in his demeanor, a withdrawal from the sociability required by his commercial position and an increasing absorption in religious and moral questions. He began to neglect his duties at the gallery, showing less interest in sales and more interest in spiritual matters. His employers noticed. In 1875, he was transferred to the Paris headquarters of Goupil, ostensibly a further advancement but perhaps also an attempt to redirect his energies. Paris did not improve matters. Vincent continued his religious studies, attended churches and prayer meetings, and grew increasingly alienated from the commercial aspects of his work. He began to see the art trade as morally compromised, as trafficking in luxury goods for the wealthy while ignoring the spiritual needs of the poor. In early 1876, after nearly 7 years with Goupil, Vincent's employment was terminated. The precise circumstances remain unclear, whether he was dismissed outright or allowed to resign, but the outcome was the same. At 23, he had failed at the career his family had arranged for him, the career that was supposed to provide stability and respectability. He returned briefly to his parents' home, now located in the village of Eton, and began searching for a new direction. What followed was a period of intense seeking and repeated failure that would last nearly 4 years. Vincent decided that his true calling was religious work, specifically ministering to the poor and outcast. He took a position as an assistant teacher at a small school in Ramsgate, England, and then moved to another school in Isleworth, where he also began preaching. His sermons were earnest and emotional, filled with the imagery of pilgrimage, suffering, and redemption. He visited the sick and the poor, distributed tracts, and tried to live according to the radical example he found in the Gospels. But teaching paid poorly, and his family grew concerned about his prospects. In 1877, with family support, Vincent moved to Amsterdam to prepare for entrance examinations to the theology faculty of the university. This was a demanding path, requiring mastery of Latin, Greek, and extensive academic preparation. Vincent studied intensely, lodging with an uncle in the city and working with a tutor, but he struggled with the classical languages and the formal requirements of academic theology. After more than a year of effort, he abandoned the attempt. He then enrolled in a shorter evangelical training program in Brussels, hoping to qualify as a missionary without the full university credential. He completed part of this training but was not offered a permanent appointment, partly because his superiors found his manner too intense, too unconventional, too difficult to manage within institutional structures. Despite this setback, Vincent was determined to do missionary work. In late 1878, he traveled on his own initiative to the Borinage, a coal mining region in southern Belgium known for its poverty and harsh working conditions. He arrived without official sanction or salary, intending to minister to the miners and their families through direct action rather than institutional approval. What he found in the Borinage was a world of extreme hardship. The miners lived in miserable conditions, working long hours underground in dangerous circumstances, earning wages that barely sustained their families. Disease, injury, and early death were common. Vincent threw himself into their community with absolute commitment. He gave away his possessions, including most of his clothing and his bed. He moved into the poorest dwelling he could find, shared the food of the miners, descended into the mines himself to understand their labor, and tended to the sick and injured after accidents. His appearance deteriorated. He stopped caring for himself, sleeping on floors, wearing rags, allowing his health to decline. When church authorities visited to evaluate his work, they were disturbed by what they saw. Vincent's methods were too extreme, his identification with the poor too complete, his neglect of conventional ministerial duties too obvious. In 1879, the Evangelical Committee declined to renew his temporary appointment. He remained in the Borinage for some months afterward, living in poverty and continuing his informal ministry, but he was now without position, without income, and without institutional support. These years of religious striving were not wasted in the sense that they shaped Vincent profoundly. He had immersed himself in the lives of working people, observed their suffering, shared their material conditions, and developed a visceral understanding of social inequality that would inform his later work as an artist. He had also discovered the limits of institutional religion, the gap between the radical message of the Gospels and the cautious respectability of church organizations. But by 1880, at the age of 27, he had failed at commerce and failed at ministry. He was living in poverty in a foreign country, estranged from his family's expectations, with no clear future. It was during this period of crisis, in the summer of 1880, that Vincent began to draw seriously. He had always sketched occasionally, copying prints and making small studies, but now drawing became something more, a discipline, a practice, a potential vocation. He wrote to Theo, who had remained with Goupil and was now working at the Paris Gallery, describing his new direction. He wanted to become an artist. He would teach himself, study the masters, work from nature and from the figure, and eventually produce works of value. Theo responded with encouragement, and crucially, with money. From this point forward, Theo would provide Vincent with a monthly allowance that made his artistic life possible. It was not charity but an arrangement between brothers, a form of support that both understood as an investment in Vincent's work and, perhaps, a future share in whatever success might come. Vincent left the Borinage and returned to his parents' home in Eton in the spring of 1881. He was nearly 28 years old, untrained in any formal sense, starting from the beginning in a field that typically required years of academic preparation. He had no teacher, no studio, no connections in the art world beyond his brother's position in the trade. What he had was determination, a growing visual intelligence shaped by years of looking at art, and the financial support that would allow him to work without immediate commercial pressure. The question of what kind of artist he would become, and whether he would become one at all, remained entirely open. Vincent's return to Eton in 1881 marked the true beginning of his artistic apprenticeship. He was living again under his parents' roof, dependent on their hospitality and on the monthly allowance Theo sent from Paris. The arrangement was practical but not comfortable. Vincent was nearly 28, a grown man who had failed at 2 careers, and his presence in the parsonage was a constant reminder of disappointment. His father remained sympathetic but bewildered by this son who seemed unable to find a stable place in the world. His mother worried about his prospects and his health. Vincent, for his part, threw himself into drawing with an intensity that left little room for the social niceties of family life. He worked constantly during this period, rising early to sketch before the light changed, walking into the countryside to draw peasants at work in the fields, copying prints and reproductions to train his hand. He had no formal instruction, so he taught himself through practice and through study of instructional manuals, particularly the drawing courses published by Charles Bargue in collaboration with Jean-Léon Gérôme. These exercises emphasized precise copying, careful observation, and the gradual development of technical control. Vincent worked through them methodically, filling sketchbooks with studies of hands, feet, figures, and landscapes. He was not a natural draftsman. His early drawings are stiff and labored, showing the effort behind every line. But he persisted, believing that skill could be acquired through sheer repetition and determination. His subject matter during the Eton period reflected the concerns that had shaped his religious years. He drew peasants, laborers, the rural poor, people whose lives were defined by physical work and material hardship. He was not interested in the picturesque or the sentimental. He wanted to capture the weight of labor, the weariness of bodies bent over shovels and hoes, the rough dignity of people who earn their bread through exhaustion. This focus on working-class subjects connected him to broader currents in 19th-century art, particularly the realist tradition exemplified by Jean-François Millet, whose paintings of peasant life Vincent had admired since his days at Goupil. Millet became a touchstone, an example of how art could dignify ordinary labor and find meaning in the lives of the poor. During his time in Eton, Vincent also experienced another romantic failure that would deepen his isolation. His cousin Kivas, recently widowed and visiting the parsonage with her young son, became the object of his intense affection. Vincent declared his feelings abruptly and was firmly rejected. He returned to Amsterdam, and Vincent, unable to accept her refusal, followed her there and attempted to see her. When her family refused him entry, He reportedly held his hand over a lamp flame, demanding to speak with her for as long as he could bear the pain. The incident horrified Key's family and embarrassed his own. It confirmed for many relatives that Vincent was unstable, that his passions were ungovernable, that he could not be trusted to behave according to social conventions. The aftermath of this episode made life in Eton untenable. Vincent quarreled bitterly with his father over the affair and over broader questions of religion and respectability. On Christmas Day 1881, the conflict reached a breaking point, and Vincent left his parents' home. He moved to The Hague, the city where he had begun his career at Goupil a decade earlier, now returning as an aspiring artist with neither credentials nor connections beyond his own determination. In The Hague, Vincent sought out Anton Mauve, a successful painter who was married to one of Vincent's cousins. Mauve was an established figure in the Hague School, a group of Dutch artists known for their atmospheric landscapes and careful attention to light and weather. He agreed to give Vincent some instruction, lending him materials, offering technical advice, and allowing him to work in his studio. For a few months, this arrangement provided Vincent with genuine guidance. Mauve introduced him to painting in oils and watercolors, pushed him to work from live models, and helped him understand the practical demands of producing finished pictures rather than mere studies. It was Mauve who encouraged Vincent to move beyond drawing exercises and begin thinking of himself as a painter. But the relationship with Mauve deteriorated quickly. Vincent was a difficult student, argumentative and resistant to advice that contradicted his own instincts. He refused to work from plaster casts, a standard academic exercise, insisting that he could only learn from living subjects. He objected to Mauve's emphasis on technique and finish, preferring rawness and directness even at the cost of conventional competence. More damaging to the relationship was Vincent's personal life. He had begun living with a woman named Clasina Maria Hornick, known as Scene, a seamstress and sometime prostitute whom he had met on the streets of The Hague. Scene was older than Vincent, already a mother, pregnant with another child, marked by poverty, alcohol, and hard use. Vincent took her and her children into his lodgings, supported them with the money Theo sent, and spoke of marrying her. This arrangement scandalized respectable society in The Hague. Mauve withdrew his support and refused further contact. Other artists and family members distanced themselves. Vincent's parents were distressed, and even Theo expressed concern, though he continued the monthly allowance that made Vincent's life and work possible. Vincent defended his choice in letters to Theo, arguing that Scene represented the very human reality he wanted to paint, that caring for her and her children was a moral duty, that bourgeois respectability was a false value he refused to honor. He genuinely believed he could save her, could build a family with her, could combine his artistic vocation with domestic commitment. For nearly 2 years, from early 1882 through the summer of 1883, Vincent lived with Scene in The Hague. The arrangement was difficult from the beginning. Money was always short, even with Theo's support, and feeding a household of 4 or 5 on an artist's uncertain income required constant calculation. Scene struggled with her health and her habits. Vincent worked relentlessly, producing hundreds of drawings during this period, studies of Scene, her mother, her children, views of the city, images of working people and the urban poor. He began painting more seriously, experimenting with oils and developing the dark, earthy palette that would characterize his early work. But domestic tension, financial pressure, and growing recognition that Scene was not going to transform into the companion he had imagined gradually eroded the relationship. By the summer of 1883, Vincent acknowledged that the situation could not continue. He and Scene separated, and he left The Hague, abandoning the urban environment for the countryside. He traveled to the province of Drenthe in the northeast of the Netherlands, a region of peat bogs, heath, and scattered farming communities that had attracted other painters seeking unspoiled landscape and traditional peasant life. Vincent spent several months there, living in cheap lodgings, walking great distances to find subjects, struggling with loneliness and difficult working conditions. The landscape was dramatic and melancholy, but practical difficulties overwhelmed him. He had no models willing to pose, no community of artists for support, and the isolation deepened his recurring depressions. By the end of 1883, he admitted defeat and returned once again to his parents' home, now located in the village of Nuenen in the southern Netherlands. The Nuenen period, lasting from December 1883 to November 1885, was the most productive phase of Vincent's early career. He was 30 years old when he arrived, still unpublished and unknown, still dependent on his brother's monthly payments, but now possessed of nearly 3 years of intensive practice. He had drawn thousands of studies, experimented with various media, developed a clear sense of the subjects he wanted to pursue and the artistic tradition he wanted to join. Nuenen offered him stability and subjects. The village and its surroundings were populated by weavers, farmers, and laborers whose lives of manual work aligned perfectly with his artistic interests. His father's parsonage provided room and board, however uncomfortable the family dynamics remained. Vincent established a working routine in Nuenen that approached professional discipline. He rose early, worked through the day, and often continued drawing or painting by lamplight into the evening. He made contact with local weavers and arranged to draw them at their looms, producing a remarkable series of studies that documented a traditional craft already being displaced by industrial production. He painted the cottages of peasants, the lanes and fields around the village, the church where his father preached. He persuaded local people to pose for him, paying small sums or offering to do favors in exchange for their time. Gradually, he accumulated a body of work that reflected his vision of rural life as a subject worthy of serious artistic attention. During the Nuenen period, Vincent also continued his self-education through intensive reading and correspondence. He exchanged letters with Theo almost weekly, sometimes more frequently, discussing art, literature, philosophy, and the practical details of his work. He read widely in French and English as well as Dutch, absorbing novels by Dickens, Zola, and the Goncourt brothers, critical writings on art, and whatever illustrated magazines he could obtain. He studied reproductions of paintings he admired, analyzing composition, color, and technique through black and white images that forced him to imagine the original effects. His letters reveal an artist thinking seriously about his place in tradition, about the social purpose of art, about the specific technical problems he was trying to solve. The culmination of the Nuenen period was a painting Vincent considered his first major work, a large canvas depicting peasants gathered around a table for their evening meal. He called it The Potato Eaters and completed it in April 1885 after extensive preparation, including numerous studies of individual figures and several preliminary versions of the complete composition. The painting shows 5 figures in a dark interior, lit only by a single oil lamp hanging above the table. Their faces are rough and weathered, their hands large and knotted from labor. They share a dish of potatoes, the simple food they have grown themselves, eating in silence after a day of work. The palette is almost monochromatic, dominated by dark browns and murky greens, with only the lamplight and the pale faces providing contrast. Vincent intended the potato eaters as a statement of artistic purpose. He wanted to show peasants as they really were, not prettified or sentimentalized, but marked by their labor and their poverty. He wrote to Theo that he had deliberately made the figures ugly, had emphasized their coarseness and their animal quality, because he believed this was more truthful than the idealized peasant scenes produced by more commercially successful painters. He wanted the viewer to feel that these people had earned their food, that their hands had dug the earth and pulled the potatoes they were eating. The painting was not meant to please but to confront, to force recognition of a way of life that bourgeois viewers preferred to ignore. When Vincent sent the painting to Theo in Paris, hoping his brother might find a buyer or at least some critical recognition, the response was discouraging. Theo's colleagues in the art trade found the work too dark, too crude, too removed from contemporary taste. Even sympathetic observers noted technical problems with the drawing and the perspective. Vincent defended his choices vigorously, insisting that he had achieved what he intended, but the failure of the potato eaters to attract any positive attention was a significant disappointment. He had invested enormous effort in the painting, had conceived it as his breakthrough work, and the rejection stung. In the months following the completion of the Potato Eaters, events in Nuenen made Vincent's position there increasingly difficult. His father died suddenly in March 1885, collapsing on the doorstep of the parsonage after returning from a walk. The loss affected Vincent deeply, despite their troubled relationship, and it also changed his practical circumstances. His mother would eventually have to leave the parsonage, and his welcome there, never warm, became cooler still. Local gossip also made life uncomfortable. A young woman who had posed for Vincent, Margot Bagman, had fallen in love with him and attempted suicide when her family forbade the relationship. The scandal reinforced Vincent's reputation as a disruptive presence, someone whose intensity brought trouble to those around him. By the autumn of 1885, Vincent was ready to leave the Netherlands. He had spent 5 years teaching himself to draw and paint, had produced hundreds of works, and had developed a distinctive artistic identity centered on the depiction of peasant life in somber, earthy tones. But he recognized that his education was incomplete. He had never studied at a proper academy, never worked from professional models, never seen the great paintings of the past except in reproduction. Paris, where Theo now held an important position at Goupil's successor firm, offered everything he lacked. It was the center of the international art world, home to the official salon and to the independent painters who were challenging academic conventions. Vincent decided to go there, to complete his training and to see for himself what modern art had become. Vincent arrived in Paris in late February 1886, appearing without warning at the gallery where Theo worked and presenting himself as a fait accompli. The brothers had discussed a possible move to Paris, but Theo had urged delay, suggesting Vincent first improve his skills at the academy in Antwerp where he had briefly studied before leaving the Netherlands. Vincent ignored this advice. He was 32 years old and patient, and convinced that Paris was where he needed to be. Theo, despite his reservations, accepted the situation. The brothers would live together in Theo's small apartment on the Rue Laval in Montmartre, and Vincent would have access to the artistic capital of the Western world. The Paris that Vincent entered in 1886 was in the midst of a profound transformation in the visual arts. The official salon still dominated the market and public attention, rewarding polished academic painting with prizes, commissions, and critical respect. But an alternative art world had emerged over the previous 2 decades, centered on artists who rejected academic conventions and pursued independent paths. The Impressionists, who had first exhibited together in 1874, had by now achieved notoriety if not universal acceptance. Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Camille Pissarro, and Edgar Degas were established figures with collectors and dealers who supported their work. A younger generation was pushing further, experimenting with color, form, and technique in ways that went beyond Impressionist precedents. Georges Seurat was developing his systematic approach to color and light, applying paint in small dots of pure pigment. Paul Gauguin was beginning to move away from Impressionism towards something more synthetic and symbolic. Paul Cézanne, working in relative isolation, was constructing paintings that treated nature as an architecture of colored planes. Vincent knew almost nothing of these developments when he arrived. His artistic education had been conducted in the Netherlands, focused on Dutch and Barbizon traditions, oriented toward the dark tones and earthy subjects he had pursued in Nuenen. The potato eaters represented everything he had learned and everything he valued. But Paris immediately began to change him. He enrolled at the studio of Fernand Cormon, an academic painter who ran a teaching atelier where students could work from live models and receive periodic criticism. The instruction itself mattered less to Vincent than the environment. At Cormon's studio he met other young artists who were engaged with contemporary developments, including Émile Bernard, Louis Anquetin, and a young man from Toulouse named Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. Through these contacts and through visits to galleries and exhibitions, Vincent encountered work that challenged everything he had previously assumed about color and light. The revelation was not instantaneous but cumulative. Over the course of 1886 and into 1887, Vincent saw Impressionist paintings in galleries and private collections, studied Japanese woodblock prints that were then fashionable among Parisian artists, visited exhibitions of the independent painters, and absorbed the visual culture of a city saturated with images. The effect on his palette was dramatic. The dark browns and murky greens of the Nuenen paintings gave way to brighter, more varied colors. He began experimenting with complementary contrasts, placing reds against greens, oranges against blues, in ways that made his canvases vibrate with optical intensity. His brushwork loosened, moving away from the careful modeling of his Dutch period toward more visible, expressive strokes that sat on the surface of the canvas rather than blending into smooth transitions. He painted constantly during the Paris years, producing more than 200 canvases in approximately 2 years. Many of these were self-portraits, a practical solution to the difficulty of finding and paying models. He painted himself in different hats, different costumes, different moods, using his own face as a laboratory for exploring color and technique. He also painted still lives, especially flowers, which allowed him to study color relationships without the complications of figure work. Views of Paris, the streets and cafés of Montmartre, the outskirts of the city where urban development met open fields, all became subjects. He traded works with other artists, building a small collection that included paintings by Bernard, Gauguin, and others who would become significant figures. The relationship with Theo during this period was both sustaining and strained. Theo continued to provide financial support, now directly through shared living expenses rather than monthly remittances. He also provided access to the art world, introducing Vincent to dealers, collectors, and artists, arranging for some of his paintings to be displayed in cafes and small exhibitions. But living together proved difficult. Vincent was demanding, argumentative, and unable to regulate his behavior according to social conventions. He dominated conversations, pursued arguments past the point of exhaustion, and created an atmosphere of tension that wore on Theo's health and patience. The small apartment became a space of conflict as well as collaboration, and Theo's letters to their mother reveal increasing concern about the arrangement's sustainability. Vincent's engagement with other artists during the Paris period was intense but often troubled. He had a gift for forming quick connections based on shared artistic interests, but his personality made sustained relationships difficult. He was opinionated to the point of dogmatism, prone to lectures and disputes, unable to accept disagreement gracefully. His friendship with Émile Bernard, nearly a decade younger and more adaptable, survived these difficulties and produced genuine exchange of ideas. His relationship with Gauguin, whom he met in late 1886 or early 1887, was more complex. Gauguin was an established figure, older than Vincent and more worldly, with a commanding presence and strong opinions of his own. Vincent admired him intensely and imagined a future collaboration, but the admiration was mixed with competition and anxiety. By the autumn of 1887, Vincent had absorbed what Paris had to offer and was beginning to feel its limitations. The city was exhausting. The constant stimulation, the social demands, the competition for attention and sales, the difficulty of finding space and quiet for sustained work, all weighed on him. His health had deteriorated, partly from poor diet and heavy drinking, partly from the nervous strain of urban life. He began to dream of escape, of moving south to a place with clearer light and cheaper living, where he might establish a studio and work without the pressures of the capital. He had read about Provence and seen Japanese prints that reminded him of the bright colors and clean lines he imagined finding in the Mediterranean landscape. The idea took hold and became a plan. In February 1888, Vincent left Paris for Auvers, a town in the south of France that he had selected almost arbitrarily, drawn by the promise of southern light and the hope of establishing a new kind of artistic community. He was 34 years old. He had been painting seriously for only about 6 years, had sold almost nothing, and remained entirely dependent on his brother's support. But he had transformed himself from a crude beginner into a genuinely original painter, had absorbed the lessons of Impressionism and moved beyond them, and had developed a vision of what art could be and what his own contribution might become. Everything he is remembered for, the paintings that would eventually hang in museums around the world, lay ahead of him in the brief period that remained. Auvers in 1888 was a provincial town of modest size, known for Roman ruins and its position at the head of the Rhone Delta. It was not an artist's colony, had no significant tradition of attracting painters, and offered none of the cultural infrastructure Vincent had known in Paris. This was precisely its appeal. He arrived in the middle of a snowstorm, unexpected weather for the south, and took lodgings at a small hotel while he searched for a more permanent arrangement. Within weeks, he had found what he was looking for, a building on the Place Lamartine that he could rent cheaply, with rooms to live and work in and space enough, he hoped, to accommodate visiting artists. He called it the Yellow House for the color of its exterior walls, and it became the center of his most productive period. The light in Auvers was everything Vincent had hoped for. After the grey skies of the Netherlands and the complicated atmospherics of Paris, the Provençal sun seemed to him almost miraculous in its intensity and clarity. Colors appeared more saturated, shadows more sharply defined, the landscape itself more vivid than anything he had previously experienced. He began painting immediately, working outdoors in the orchards around the town where fruit trees were coming into bloom. Over the spring of 1888, he produced a series of paintings depicting flowering peach, apricot, and plum trees, canvases alive with whites and pinks against blue skies, celebrating the renewal of the season and his own sense of artistic rebirth. The pace of work in Auvers was extraordinary even by Vincent's standards. He painted almost daily when weather permitted, sometimes completing a canvas in a single session, sometimes returning to subjects over multiple days. He wrote to Theo that he felt compelled to work quickly, that the motifs he found were so compelling he could not afford to hesitate. The results poured out: landscapes of the surrounding countryside, views of the town and its bridges, portraits of local people he persuaded to pose, still lives arranged in his studio. His technique continued to evolve, the brushstrokes becoming more rhythmic and directional, applied in parallel bands that followed the contours of objects and created a sense of movement across the surface. Colors intensified beyond what direct observation could justify, pushed toward expressive effects that conveyed emotional response as much as visual appearance. One of his primary subjects during the Auvers period was the landscape itself, the flat fields stretching toward distant mountains, the roads lined with cypress trees, the wheat growing toward harvest. He painted the same motifs at different times of day and in different seasons, tracking the changes in light and color that marked the passage of time. The harvest scenes of June 1888 showed golden wheat under intense blue skies, the yellow and blue complementary contrast that had become a signature of his palette. Night scenes followed, attempts to capture the appearance of the town under gaslight and starlight, pushing into territory that challenged the limits of what paint could represent. Vincent also pursued his long-held ambition of painting working people, though the subjects in Auvers were different from the Dutch peasants of his earlier work. He painted the Zoo soldiers stationed in the town, their colorful uniforms providing opportunities for bold chromatic effects. He painted the postman Joseph Roulin and his family, establishing a relationship that produced multiple portraits over his time in Auvers. Roulin was a Republican and free thinker, sympathetic to Vincent's unconventional presence, willing to sit for extended sessions and to offer friendship without judgment. The portraits of the Roulin family, especially the several versions of Joseph himself with his magnificent beard and postal uniform, became some of the most human and approachable works of the Auvers period. Throughout these months of intensive production, Vincent continued to imagine the Yellow House as the foundation of an artist's community. He called it the Studio of the South and dreamed of assembling a group of like-minded painters who would live and work together, sharing expenses and ideas, supporting each other's development. The model was partly the artistic communities he had read about, partly a vision of collaborative practice that might counter the isolation and competition of the commercial art world. He wrote to various artists inviting them to join him, offering the hospitality of the Yellow House and the advantages of the southern climate. Most declined or failed to respond. But Gauguin, struggling financially and looking for alternatives to the expensive life of Paris and Brittany, eventually agreed to come. The prospect of Gauguin's arrival electrified Vincent. He prepared the Yellow House obsessively, painting decorations for the rooms, arranging furnishings, imagining the conversations and collaborations to come. He produced a series of sunflower paintings specifically intended to decorate the guest room, brilliant yellows against backgrounds of yellow and blue, the flowers at various stages from fresh bloom to wilting seed heads. These paintings were meant as a welcome, a demonstration of what the Studio of the South could produce, and they remain among the most recognizable images in the history of art. Vincent wanted everything to be ready, wanted to impress his guest, wanted the collaboration to succeed in ways that would justify his vision and vindicate his sacrifices. Gauguin arrived in Auvers on the 23rd of October 1888. He was 40 years old, experienced, confident, and committed to his own artistic direction. He came not as a disciple, or even a full partner, but as a visitor whose expenses were being paid by Theo in exchange for paintings, an arrangement that gave the visit a commercial dimension neither man could entirely ignore. For the next 9 weeks, the two artists lived and worked together in the Yellow House, painting the same subjects, debating artistic questions, and gradually discovering how incompatible their temperaments and methods actually were. The collaboration between Vincent and Gauguin began with optimism and mutual respect. Both men were serious painters committed to work that went beyond Impressionist naturalism towards something more expressive and synthetic. They admired each other's achievements and recognized the value of artistic dialogue. In the early weeks, they painted together, visited the same sites around Auvers, and engaged in long discussions about art, technique, and the direction their work should take. Gauguin, more experienced and more confident in his methods, tended to lead these conversations. Vincent, despite his strong opinions, deferred to his guest in ways that reflected both genuine admiration and anxiety about maintaining the collaboration. Their working methods, however, proved fundamentally different. Vincent painted primarily from direct observation, setting up his easel before a motif and working rapidly to capture what he saw. His process was immediate, emotional, responsive to the subject before him. Gauguin preferred to work from memory and imagination, making sketches on site but executing finished paintings in the studio, where he could compose more deliberately and push further from naturalistic appearance. He urged Vincent to adopt this approach, arguing that painting from imagination allowed greater artistic freedom and more complete realization of the painter's vision. Vincent tried to follow this advice, producing several works during the collaboration that drew more heavily on memory than direct observation. But the method felt unnatural to him, and the results, while interesting, lacked the conviction of his observational paintings. The tensions between them extended beyond technique to matters of daily life. The Yellow House was small, and two strong personalities with different habits and rhythms found it difficult to share the space harmoniously. Gauguin was neater, more organized, more controlled in his behavior. Vincent was chaotic, intense, prone to moods that swung from elation to despair. He drank heavily, ate poorly, and worked himself into states of nervous exhaustion. Arguments became more frequent as the weeks passed, disputes about art that expanded into broader conflicts about values and priorities. Gauguin began to consider leaving, writing to Theo that the situation was becoming impossible, that Vincent's behavior was increasingly erratic and alarming. The crisis came in late December 1888. The precise sequence of events remains unclear, reconstructed from fragmentary and sometimes contradictory evidence. What is certain is that on the evening of December 23, after a period of escalating tension, Vincent suffered a breakdown of some kind. According to Gauguin's later account, Vincent threatened him with a razor during an argument, though Gauguin may have embellished or misremembered the details. What is not disputed is that later that night, Vincent used the razor on himself, severing part of his left ear. He then wrapped the severed portion in newspaper and delivered it to a woman at a local brothel, apparently a worker he knew named Rachel. He returned to the Yellow House and collapsed from blood loss. Police found him the next morning, unconscious and in serious condition. Gauguin left Auvers immediately, telegraphing Theo in Paris and departing before Vincent regained consciousness. The collaboration was over, ended by violence and breakdown after less than 2 months. Theo arrived from Paris on Christmas Day, finding his brother hospitalized and barely coherent. The local authorities, alarmed by the incident, considered Vincent a danger to himself and possibly to others. He was placed under medical supervision, treated for his wound, and observed for signs of further instability. The nature of Vincent's illness has been debated ever since. Contemporary physicians diagnosed epilepsy, a term that in the 19th century covered a broader range of conditions than it does today. Later analysts have proposed various alternative explanations, including bipolar disorder, acute intermittent porphyria, temporal lobe epilepsy, and the effects of chronic alcohol abuse and malnutrition. The truth is that no definitive diagnosis is possible from the available evidence. What is clear is that Vincent experienced periodic crises characterized by confusion, hallucination, and loss of control, followed by periods of relative lucidity during which he was capable of sustained, disciplined work. The pattern would repeat several times over the remaining 18 months of his life. After 2 weeks in the hospital, Vincent was released and returned to the Yellow House. He attempted to resume work, painting a self-portrait with a bandaged ear and beginning new canvases that showed no diminishment of his artistic powers. But his position in Auvers had become precarious. Neighbors who had previously tolerated his eccentricities now viewed him with fear and suspicion. A petition circulated demanding that he be confined or expelled from the town. In February 1889, following another episode of breakdown, local authorities had him committed to the hospital again and sealed the Yellow House. Vincent was now effectively homeless as well as ill, unable to return to his studio or access his possessions. During this period of repeated hospitalization, Vincent reached a decision about his future. He could not continue in Auvers, could not live independently without risking further crises and possible harm to himself or others. Theo, managing the situation from Paris, explored options for care. The choice fell on the asylum of Saint Paul de Marseille, a former monastery in the town of Saint-Rémy de Provence, about 20 kilometers northeast of Auvers. The facility accepted patients who could pay for their care, offering private rooms and relative freedom of movement within the grounds. In early May 1889, Vincent admitted himself voluntarily, beginning a year of institutionalization that would prove remarkably productive artistically while failing to resolve his underlying condition. Saint-Rémy was both a refuge and a prison. The asylum occupied a beautiful setting, surrounded by olive groves and wheat fields, with views of the Alpilles Mountains in the distance. Vincent was given 2 rooms, one to sleep in and one to use as a studio. He was allowed to paint within the asylum grounds and, when accompanied by an attendant, to venture into the surrounding countryside. The regimen was not harsh, consisting mainly of baths, rest, and observation, with no effective treatment for whatever ailed him. Vincent found the other patients disturbing, their cries and behaviors a constant reminder of his own fragility. But he also found the environment conducive to work, and work became his primary means of managing his condition. The paintings produced at Saint-Rémy represent some of Vincent's most powerful and distinctive achievements. Cut off from the social subjects that had occupied him in Auvers, he turned increasingly to landscape, finding in the Provençal terrain around the asylum a visual vocabulary that expressed inner states as much as external appearances. The cypresses that dotted the hillsides became a particular obsession, their dark vertical forms twisting upward like flames against turbulent skies. He painted them repeatedly, exploring different compositions and lighting conditions, pushing the trees toward almost abstract patterns of writhing brushwork. The olive groves offered similar opportunities, their gnarled trunks and silver-green leaves rendered with rhythmic strokes that unified figure and ground into continuous movement. Perhaps the most celebrated painting from the Saint-Rémy period depicts the view from Vincent's window in the hours before dawn. The canvas shows a night sky dominated by a crescent moon and a large star, their light spreading in concentric circles across a sky that rolls and swirls with cosmic energy. Below, a village sleeps, its church spire rising toward the heavens, while in the foreground a great cypress tree flames upward like a dark fire connecting earth to sky. The painting, known today as The Starry Night, was based on observation but transformed by imagination, the actual appearance of the night sky intensified and reimagined as a vision of natural forces in dynamic motion. Vincent himself considered it a study rather than a finished work, too dependent on abstraction and imagination to satisfy his commitment to painting from nature. He could not have known that it would become one of the most reproduced and recognized images in Western art. The year at Saint-Rémy was punctuated by further breakdowns. Vincent experienced several episodes of crisis, periods lasting days or weeks during which he could not work and remained confined to his room. These attacks followed no clear pattern and came without warning, interrupting periods of lucid productivity with sudden collapses into confusion and despair. During one episode, he reportedly attempted to swallow paint, necessitating the removal of his materials until he recovered. The cycles of illness and recovery created an unstable rhythm, productive weeks followed by lost time, achievement alternating with incapacity. Despite these interruptions, the volume of work produced at Saint-Rémy was remarkable. Vincent completed approximately 150 paintings during his 12 months at the asylum, along with hundreds of drawings. He continued to paint self-portraits, his own face becoming a subject he could study without needing a model or permission to leave the grounds. He made copies of prints by artists he admired, translating black and white reproductions of works by Millet, Delacroix, and Rembrandt into his own color vocabulary, using these exercises to study composition and technique while confined to his studio. He painted the asylum itself, its corridors and gardens, the view from his window at different times of day and night. Throughout this period, Theo remained Vincent's lifeline to the outside world. The brothers corresponded constantly, Theo sending money, materials, news of the Paris art world, and emotional support, Vincent responding with accounts of his work, his health, and his hopes. Theo also worked to promote Vincent's reputation, showing his paintings to dealers and collectors, arranging for works to be included in exhibitions of independent artists. In January 1890, a critic named Albert Aurier published an enthusiastic article about Vincent in the journal Mercure de France, the first significant critical attention his work had received. The article praised Vincent's originality and power, identifying him as a major figure among the new generation of painters. Vincent was deeply moved by the recognition but also troubled, fearing that the attention was premature, that his work did not yet deserve such claims. More tangible validation came the same month when one of Vincent's paintings actually sold. The Red Vineyard, a canvas depicting grape harvest near Auvers, was purchased by a Belgian collector named Anna Bach for 400 francs. It was the only sale of Vincent's work during his lifetime, though the significance of this fact has been somewhat overstated in popular accounts. Theo regularly traded Vincent's paintings with other artists, and occasionally found buyers for drawings. The art market of the period was complex, and commercial success was not simply a matter of sales to collectors. Still, the purchase confirmed that Vincent's work could find appreciative audiences beyond his immediate circle. By early 1890, Vincent had grown desperate to leave Saint-Rémy. The asylum had served its purpose, providing stability and the opportunity to work, but it could not cure him, and the environment increasingly felt like imprisonment. He wanted to return to the north, to be closer to Theo and to familiar landscapes, to escape the intensity of the southern light that he sometimes felt was damaging his eyes and his mind. Theo, now married and expecting a child, searched for arrangements that might allow Vincent to live independently while remaining under some form of medical supervision. The solution appeared in the person of Paul Gachet, a physician living in Auvers, a village about 20 miles northwest of Paris. Gachet was an unusual figure, a medical doctor with a specialty in nervous disorders who was also an amateur artist and collector with connections to the Impressionist circle. He had known Pissarro, Cézanne, and others, and his home contained a substantial collection of their works. He agreed to take on Vincent as a patient of sorts, offering informal supervision and the companionship of someone who understood artistic temperament. The village itself was attractive, a quiet community of old houses and thatched roofs that had drawn painters for decades, offering rural subjects within easy reach of Paris. In May 1890, Vincent left Saint-Rémy and traveled north. He stopped briefly in Paris to meet his new nephew, also named Vincent Willem, and to see Theo's wife Jo, and the accumulated works that had been stored in their apartment. Then he continued to Auvers, where he took a room at a modest inn and prepared to begin again. He was 37 years old, had been institutionalized for a year, and had no certainty that his condition would not recur. But he was also a mature artist with a distinctive vision and a substantial body of work, finally receiving recognition from critics and collectors, finally within reach of the artistic community and family he had left behind. The final chapter of his life was about to begin. Auvers in the early summer of 1890 was a village of approximately 2,000 inhabitants, situated on the right bank of the Oise River in a landscape of gentle hills, wheat fields, and thatched cottages. The community had attracted artists for decades, drawn by its picturesque architecture and accessible countryside, by the quality of light on the river and the old church that dominated the village center. Pissarro had worked there, as had Cézanne and Daubigny. It was a place associated with the landscape painting tradition that Vincent admired, close enough to Paris to allow visits, but removed from the pressures and expenses of the capital. For a painter seeking to recover his health while continuing to work, it seemed an ideal situation. Vincent arrived in Auvers on May 20, 1890, and immediately presented himself to Dr. Gachet. The two men took to each other quickly. Gachet was 61 years old, a widower living with his son and daughter in a house filled with art and eccentricity. He had red hair, a melancholic temperament, and a genuine interest in Vincent's work and condition. Vincent found in him a sympathetic presence, someone who understood both the artistic vocation and the nervous disorders that plagued creative temperaments. Within days of their first meeting, Vincent pronounced Gachet a friend and began working on a portrait, capturing the doctor seated at a table with foxglove flowers, his expression conveying the melancholy that Vincent recognized as a shared characteristic. The initial weeks in Auvers were remarkably productive. Vincent threw himself into work with an intensity that matched or exceeded his most active periods in Auvers and Saint-Rémy. He painted daily, sometimes completing a canvas before noon and starting another in the afternoon. The village and its surroundings offered abundant subjects. The old church with its Romanesque architecture, the town hall draped in flags for Bastille Day celebrations, the thatched cottages with their gardens and surrounding fields, the vast expanses of wheat ripening toward harvest. He painted Gachet's garden with its lush vegetation, the stairway leading up the hillside into the village, the inn where he lodged, the faces of local people who agreed to pose. His technique in Auvers continued the evolution evident in his late Saint-Rémy work. The brushstrokes became longer and more emphatic, applied in parallel bands that created rhythmic patterns across the canvas surface. Colors remained intense but took on a different character, the harsh contrasts of the southern paintings giving way to harmonies that reflected the gentler light of the north. Blue appeared frequently in skies that seemed to press down on the landscape, in shadows that pooled beneath trees and buildings. The paintings of this period have a quality of urgency, as if Vincent were racing against time to capture everything before him, knowing that his periods of productive clarity might not last. In June, Vincent traveled to Paris to visit Theo, Joe, and the infant nephew who bore his name. The visit was complicated. Theo was under considerable strain, managing a difficult situation at work, supporting both his own growing family and his brother's needs, worrying constantly about Vincent's health and stability. The apartment was crowded with Vincent's paintings, stacked against walls and stored wherever space allowed, a physical accumulation of years of support without commercial return. The reunion was happy but also tense, the underlying anxieties of both brothers surfacing in the close quarters of the Parisian flat. Vincent returned to Auvers after only a few days, preferring the quiet of the village to the complications of the city. Throughout June and into early July, Vincent maintained his extraordinary pace of production. He experimented with new formats, painting several double-square canvases that emphasized horizontal extension, formats suited to the broad vistas of wheat fields stretching toward distant horizons. These elongated paintings created an effect of panoramic immersion, the viewer's eye traveling across expanses of golden grain beneath turbulent skies. One of these canvases, depicting crows rising from a wheat field against a darkening sky, has often been interpreted as a premonition of death, though this reading imposes retrospective knowledge on a painting that may have intended nothing of the sort. Vincent was simply painting what he saw, the fields around Auvers as harvest approached, the weather changing, the birds that populated the agricultural landscape. The portraits from this period show Vincent engaging with his subjects more directly than in earlier work. He painted the daughter of his innkeeper, Adeline Revue, a girl of 13 in a blue dress against a blue background, her expression serious and unreadable. He painted Gachet multiple times, exploring different aspects of the doctor's personality and different compositional approaches. He painted a young woman in white, seated at a piano, the simple composition emphasizing the geometric relationships of figure and furniture. Each portrait represented a negotiation between the demands of likeness and the expressive possibilities of color and brushwork, Vincent finding ways to convey character through chromatic choices rather than conventional rendering. Letters from this period reveal a mind still fully engaged with artistic questions. Vincent wrote to Theo about his experiments with color, his plans for future paintings, his thoughts on the work of other artists. He discussed practical matters of materials and money, the ongoing need for canvas and paint, the hope that sales might eventually reduce his dependence on his brother's support. He expressed concern about Theo's health and the pressures of his position at the gallery. The correspondence shows no obvious signs of approaching crisis, no explicit statements of despair or intention to harm himself. Whatever Vincent was experiencing internally remained largely hidden from his written communications. By mid-July, however, indications of trouble began to appear. Vincent mentioned in letters that he felt uncertain about the future, that he worried about being a burden on Theo, that the pressures facing his brother weighed on his own spirits. He wrote of vast wheat fields under troubled skies, of attempting to express sadness and extreme loneliness through his paintings. Whether these statements reflected deepening depression or simply the honest acknowledgement of difficult circumstances is impossible to determine at this distance. Artists often describe their work in emotional terms without implying personal crisis. But something was shifting in Vincent's state of mind during those final weeks in Auvers. On July 27, 1890, a Sunday, Vincent went out in the afternoon with his painting materials. The precise details of what followed remain uncertain, pieced together from later accounts that contain inconsistencies and gaps. What is known is that he returned to the inn that evening, wounded, and made his way upstairs to his room. The innkeeper found him there, suffering from a gunshot wound to the chest. When asked what had happened, Vincent reportedly replied that he had shot himself. A doctor was summoned, followed by Gachet, but the wound was serious and the bullet could not be removed. Theo was notified and arrived from Paris the next morning. The brothers spent Vincent's final hours together in the small room at the inn, Theo sitting by the bed while Vincent smoked his pipe and spoke in both Dutch and French. According to Theo's later account, Vincent expressed no regret about dying, suggesting that this was how he wanted it, that there was no point in prolonging a life of suffering. In the early morning hours of July 29, 1890, Vincent van Gogh died. He was 37 years old. The circumstances of his death have been questioned and debated ever since. The conventional account holds that Vincent shot himself in the chest while in a wheat field outside the village, then walked back to the inn where he was found. This narrative presents difficulties. The wound was in the abdomen rather than the head or heart, an unusual choice for someone intending suicide. The gun was never found. Vincent made no explicit statement of suicidal intent in his final letters. Some researchers have proposed alternative explanations, suggesting that Vincent may have been shot accidentally or even deliberately by others, perhaps by local teenagers who had been tormenting him. According to this theory, Vincent chose not to implicate his assailants, accepting death as a release from his struggles. No definitive resolution of these questions is possible given the available evidence. What remains clear is that Vincent died of a gunshot wound in Auvers-sur-Oise at the end of July 1890, and that he did not seek to save himself once wounded. Whether his death resulted from deliberate self-harm, accident, or assault, he accepted its approach without apparent resistance. The funeral took place on July 30th. Theo organized the arrangements, gathering what mourners could be assembled on short notice. Émile Bernard arrived from Paris, as did several other artists who had known Vincent. Gachet spoke briefly, overcome with emotion. The coffin was surrounded by sunflowers, the flowers Vincent had painted so memorably in Arles, a visual tribute that Gachet had arranged. Vincent was buried in the cemetery of Auvers-sur-Oise, his grave marked by a simple headstone among the ordinary inhabitants of the village. Theo was devastated by his brother's death. The two had been bound together by ties of blood, affection, and financial interdependence for more than a decade. Theo had supported Vincent through every crisis, every failure, every period of illness and recovery. He had believed in Vincent's talent when almost no one else did, had invested his own resources and professional reputation in promoting work that the market consistently rejected. Now that investment had ended, leaving Theo with hundreds of paintings, thousands of drawings, and the accumulated weight of years of sacrifice. The loss proved more than Theo could bear. In the months following Vincent's death, his own health collapsed. He had been suffering from a chronic illness, probably syphilis contracted years earlier, and the grief and strain accelerated his decline. By October 1890, he was experiencing symptoms of mental deterioration, including confusion, paranoia, and episodes of violence. He was committed to an asylum in the Netherlands, where he died on January 25, 1891, less than 6 months after his brother. He was 33 years old. The deaths of both brothers within half a year left Vincent's artistic legacy in uncertain hands. Theo's widow, Johanna van Gogh, inherited the vast collection of paintings and drawings that had accumulated in the Paris apartment, along with the extensive correspondence between the brothers. She was 28 years old, a widow with an infant son, possessing an archive of works by an artist who had achieved almost no commercial success and only the beginnings of critical recognition. The question of what to do with this inheritance, how to preserve it, how to present it to the world, how to establish Vincent's place in art history, fell to her. Johanna proved equal to the task. She moved back to the Netherlands with her son and the collection, dedicating herself to the work of building Vincent's reputation. She organized exhibitions, loaned paintings to museums and galleries, negotiated sales that would establish market value while keeping key works together. Most importantly, she began the monumental task of transcribing, editing, and eventually publishing the letters between Vincent and Theo, recognizing that this correspondence provided essential context for understanding the paintings and the man who made them. The letters were extraordinary documents. Vincent had written to Theo regularly throughout his artistic career, sometimes daily, producing an archive of hundreds of letters that documented his development, his ideas, his struggles, and his aspirations in remarkable detail. He wrote about specific paintings, explaining his intentions and techniques. He discussed the artists he admired and the artistic movements he observed. He described his daily life, his relationships, his mental states, his hopes and disappointments. No other major artist of the period left such a complete record of their inner life and working process. When Johanna published selected letters in 1914, they transformed understanding of Vincent's work, providing a narrative of artistic dedication and personal tragedy that resonated powerfully with early 20th century audiences. The transformation of Vincent van Gogh from obscure failure to cultural icon did not happen immediately. In the years following his death, his reputation grew gradually, building through a combination of exhibitions, publications, and the tireless promotional work of those who believed in his significance. The process took decades, moving through distinct phases as different aspects of his work and life captured public attention. What emerged was not simply recognition of artistic achievement, but the construction of a mythology, a narrative of the suffering genius whose torment produced transcendent beauty. This mythology would shape how Vincent was understood for generations, sometimes illuminating and sometimes obscuring the actual nature of his accomplishment. In the 1890s, immediately after his death, Vincent remained known primarily within avant-garde artistic circles. The Impressionists and Post-Impressionists who had known him, the younger painters who had exchanged works with him, the critics who followed developments in independent art, these were his initial audience. Small exhibitions in Paris, Brussels, and the Netherlands displayed selections from his work to audiences already disposed to appreciate unconventional painting. Reviews were mixed but increasingly respectful, recognizing something powerful in the intense colors and expressive brushwork even when the paintings challenged established standards of finish and composition. The first major retrospective came in 1901, when the Gallery Bernheingen in Paris mounted an exhibition of 71 Van Gogh paintings. This was a substantial presentation, allowing viewers to survey the range and development of Vincent's work in a way that scattered appearances in group shows could not achieve. Critics responded with growing enthusiasm, recognizing a body of work that held together despite its apparent rawness, that communicated with emotional directness unusual in painting of any period. The exhibition established Vincent as a significant figure in recent art history, worthy of serious critical attention and museum acquisition. Over the following decade, his reputation continued to build. German collectors and curators proved particularly receptive, acquiring paintings for private collections and public museums at a time when French institutions remained more cautious. The dealer Paul Cassirer organized exhibitions in Berlin that introduced Vincent to German audiences, while critics associated with expressionist movements claimed him as a precursor, finding in his distorted forms and heightened colors a model for their own rejection of naturalism. This German enthusiasm had lasting consequences, placing major works in collections that would eventually form the basis of important museum holdings and establishing interpretive frameworks that emphasized emotional intensity over formal innovation. The publication of Vincent's letters amplified his growing fame by providing a compelling personal narrative to accompany the visual impact of the paintings. Johanna's 1914 edition presented Vincent as a figure of almost saintly dedication, a man who sacrificed everything for his art, who suffered rejection and illness while producing works of profound beauty. The letters revealed him as articulate, thoughtful, and deeply engaged with questions of meaning and purpose. Readers who might have found the paintings difficult could approach them through the accessible humanity of the correspondence, understanding the sunflowers and wheat fields as expressions of a soul they had come to know through his words. The First World War interrupted the cultural commerce that had been building Vincent's international reputation, but the post-war period saw an intensification of interest. The 1920s brought major exhibitions, scholarly publications, and the establishment of Van Gogh as a canonical figure in the narrative of modern art. Art historians placed him at a crucial junction in the development of European painting, the point where Impressionist attention to light and color transformed into Expressionist concern with subjective feeling. His influence on subsequent movements was traced and documented, from German Expressionism to Fauvism to various strands of 20th century abstraction. The popular mythology that grew up around Vincent drew heavily on the dramatic elements of his biography. The Severier became an emblem of artistic madness, a symbol of the sacrifice that genius supposedly required. The suicide confirmed the tragic trajectory, the brilliant flame burning too intensely to sustain itself. The posthumous fame contrasted with lifetime rejection created a parable of misunderstood vision, of an artist so far ahead of his time that contemporary audiences could not recognize his value. These narrative elements simplified and distorted the historical reality but proved irresistibly compelling to popular imagination. The single sale during his lifetime, the 400 francs paid for the Red Vineyard, became a touchstone of the mythology, cited endlessly as proof that Vincent died without recognition or reward. The fact was technically accurate but misleading. Vincent's paintings were exhibited, discussed, and exchanged with other artists throughout his career. Critics began noticing his work before his death, and the Auvers article of January 1890 represented genuine if limited recognition. The art market of the late 19th century did not function as a simple mechanism where quality automatically produced sales. Many artists who are now considered major figures struggled commercially during their lifetimes. Vincent's lack of sales reflected market conditions, his difficult personality, and the unconventional nature of his work, not simply a failure of contemporary taste to recognize obvious merit. Similarly, the emphasis on madness and suffering, while grounded in real episodes of mental illness, obscured the discipline and professionalism that characterized most of Vincent's working life. He was not a naive outsider producing art in frenzy but a trained observer who had spent years studying technique, analyzing the work of masters, and developing a sophisticated understanding of color theory and composition. His paintings were not spontaneous effusions but carefully constructed works that drew on extensive preparation and deliberate choices. The visible brushwork that seemed to reveal raw emotion was itself a technique, learned from other painters and refined through practice, not an involuntary expression of inner turmoil. The market for Vincent's work developed alongside his critical reputation. Prices rose steadily through the early 20th century, accelerating after major exhibitions and publications. Johanna managed sales carefully, releasing works into the market at a pace that built value without flooding it, keeping important paintings together while allowing others to enter collections that would give them visibility. After her death in 1925, her son, Vincent Willem van Gogh, continued this stewardship, eventually placing the core family collection on long-term loan to the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, and later establishing the foundation that would create the Van Gogh Museum. By mid-century, Vincent had achieved a level of fame that transcended the art world. His life story, with its dramatic reversals and tragic conclusion, appealed to popular audiences who might never visit a museum. The 1934 biographical novel Lust for Life by Irving Stone became a bestseller, presenting Vincent's story in accessible narrative form that reached millions of readers. The 1956 film adaptation, with Kirk Douglas in the title role, brought the story to even wider audiences, establishing visual images of Vincent as a tortured, passionate figure that influenced public perception for decades. These popular representations prioritized drama over accuracy, compressing timelines, inventing dialogue, and emphasizing romantic elements that the historical record did not support. The post-war art market, fueled by American wealth and a growing conviction that modern art represented sound investment, drove Van Gogh prices to unprecedented levels. Paintings that had sold for modest sums in the early 20th century changed hands for millions of dollars by its close. The 1987 sale of irises for nearly $54 million and the 1990 sale of Portrait of Dr. Gachet for over $82 million established Van Gogh as the most expensive artist in auction history at the time. These prices reflected not just aesthetic appreciation but the status that ownership of a Van Gogh conferred, the entry it provided into a realm of cultural prestige that transcended national boundaries and social origins. The Van Gogh Museum opened in Amsterdam in 1973, providing a permanent home for the family collection and a center for scholarly research. The museum's holdings, comprising more than 200 paintings and 500 drawings along with extensive archival material, allowed comprehensive study of Vincent's development and methods. Exhibitions drawn from this collection traveled internationally, introducing new generations to the paintings in original form rather than reproduction. The museum also facilitated conservation research, technical analysis of materials and techniques that revealed how Vincent actually constructed his images beneath the apparent spontaneity of their surfaces. Scholarly understanding of Vincent evolved as new evidence emerged and interpretive frameworks shifted. The complete edition of the letters, published in 2009, made the full correspondence available with extensive annotation and contextual material. Medical researchers debated the nature of his illness, proposing various diagnoses based on described symptoms and known behaviors. Art historians examined his relationship to contemporaries and predecessors, tracing influences and connections that complicated the image of isolated genius. The figure that emerged from serious study was more complex than the popular mythology allowed, a man of contradictions and capabilities, of learning and instinct, of careful planning and impulsive action. The question of what made Vincent's paintings so compelling to such diverse audiences resisted simple answer. The immediate visual impact was undeniable. The colors possessed an intensity that registered even in reproduction, yellows and blues that seemed to vibrate against each other with almost physical force. The brushwork created texture that invited touch, surfaces built from accumulated strokes that recorded the motion of the painter's hand. The subjects, while often ordinary, landscapes and still lives and portraits that countless other painters had attempted, took on a presence that transcended their apparent simplicity. Part of the appeal lay in the legibility of effort. Vincent's paintings showed the labor that produced them in a way that more polished work concealed. Viewers could see the strokes, count them almost, follow the direction of the brush across the canvas. This visibility created a sense of connection to the painter, an intimacy that allowed viewers to feel they were witnessing the act of creation rather than simply its result. The man holding the brush seemed present in the work in a way that the smooth surfaces of academic painting did not permit. The emotional resonance was equally important. Whether or not Vincent's paintings actually expressed his inner states, viewers experienced them as emotionally charged. The swirling skies and twisting cypresses seemed to embody feeling, to make visible the invisible movements of psychic life. This perception aligned with popular understanding of art as expression, the romantic notion that genuine creation emerged from authentic emotion rather than technical skill alone. Vincent's documented suffering gave permission to read his paintings as records of that suffering, to find in the visual turbulence confirmation of the biographical turbulence that produced it. The paintings themselves, considered apart from the mythology that surrounded them, represented a distinctive solution to problems that occupied late 19th century artists generally. The challenge of how to paint after Impressionism, how to move beyond the dissolution of form into light and atmosphere towards something more structured and permanent, engaged an entire generation. Cézanne pursued geometric simplification, building landscapes and still lives from planes of color that suggested underlying architecture. Seurat developed systematic application of divided color, attempting to place Impressionist intuition on scientific foundation. Gauguin moved towards synthesis and symbol, flattening space and simplifying form to achieve decorative unity and expressive power. Vincent's path was different from all of these, though he learned from each. His solution centered on the brushstroke itself as a unit of construction. Where Impressionist technique dissolved contours into flickering touches of color, Vincent's mature paintings used the stroke to build form, to define shape and direction through the accumulated marks of the brush. Each stroke was visible, distinct, carrying its own weight and direction while contributing to larger patterns that organized the canvas. In the wheat fields of Auvers, the strokes follow the lie of the land, curving over hills and straightening across plains. In the cypresses of Saint-Rémy, they spiral upward, tracing the growth of the trees toward the sky. In the portraits, they follow the contours of faces and bodies, modeling form through direction rather than tonal gradation. This technique created surfaces of extraordinary density and energy. A Van Gogh painting, seen in original rather than reproduction, presents a physical presence that photographs cannot convey. The paint sits on the canvas in ridges and peaks, casting tiny shadows that change with viewing angle and lighting conditions. The colors interact not just optically but materially, thick applications of yellow and pastel catching light differently than the thinner blues that surround them. The paintings demand to be seen as objects, physical things made of pigment and medium, not simply as images representing other things. The color relationships in Vincent's mature work reflected both study and instinct. He had read and absorbed contemporary color theory, particularly the writings of Charles Blanc and the work of Eugene Delacroix, learning about complementary contrasts and the emotional associations of different hues. He applied this knowledge systematically, composing paintings around dominant color chords that gave each work its characteristic mood. The yellows and blues of the Al's paintings, the greens and oranges of the olive groves, the violets and yellows of certain portraits, these were not arbitrary choices but deliberate structures that organized visual experience towards specific effects. Yet theory alone did not determine his color. Vincent pushed beyond what observation or science would justify, intensifying hues and simplifying relationships to achieve expressive results that trumped naturalistic accuracy. The night sky of the Starry Night does not record actual celestial appearance, but reimagines it as cosmic drama. The yellow of the sunflower paintings exceeds what any flower actually displays, becoming an idea of yellow, an essence rather than a description. This willingness to depart from what the eye sees in favor of what the painting needs distinguished Vincent from more faithful observers and aligned him with the synthetic tendencies of Gauguin and the symbolists. The subjects Vincent chose connected his formal innovations to human meaning. He was not an abstract painter, not interested in color and form for their own sake. He painted recognizable things, landscapes and objects and people, and he wanted those things to communicate, to speak to viewers about life and its conditions. The peasants of his early work embodied labor and endurance. The sunflowers expressed gratitude and welcome. The wheat fields signified the cycles of growth and harvest that structured agricultural existence. Even the most apparently abstract of his late landscapes, the swirling skies and twisted trees, represented actual places observed and transformed, not pure inventions of the studio. This commitment to subject matter placed Vincent somewhat outside the main trajectory of modernist development, which moved increasingly toward abstraction and formal autonomy. The painters who came after him, the Fauve and Expressionists and eventually the pure abstractionists, took from his work what served their purposes: the liberation of color, the expressive brushwork, the willingness to distort, while leaving behind his attachment to representation and meaning. Vincent would not have recognized himself in much of what claimed his influence. He remained, to the end, a painter who wanted his pictures to say something about the world, not merely to exist as beautiful objects. The portraits constitute a particularly revealing body of work. Vincent painted people throughout his career, from the dark studies of Dutch peasants to the vivid characterizations of his final years. He approached portraiture as a form of relationship, an attempt to capture not just appearance but essence, to show through color and form something of who the sitter was. The postman Rulin appears across multiple canvases as a figure of solidity and warmth, his blue uniform and red beard recurring elements that Vincent explored in different compositions and color schemes. The Arlésienne, based on Madame Junot, who ran a café Vincent frequented, appears in versions that range from quickly sketched studies to elaborately finished compositions. These were not commissions but personal projects, paintings of people Vincent knew and wanted to understand through the act of painting them. His self-portraits form a subset of particular intensity. Vincent painted himself more than 40 times, using his own face as a subject available without cost or negotiation whenever he needed to work on the human figure. The accumulation of these self-images across his artistic career creates an autobiography in paint, tracking changes in technique, health, and self-conception. The early self-portraits show a younger man, bearded and serious, rendered in the dark tones of the Dutch period. The Paris self-portraits experiment with Impressionist and Pointillist techniques, the face becoming a laboratory for color investigation. The Auvers and Saint-Rémy self-portraits carry the intensity of those periods, the bandaged ear, the fixed gaze, the backgrounds of swirling color that seem to externalize inner states. What the self-portraits reveal, beyond technical development, is a persistent self-scrutiny that borders on the obsessive. Vincent looked at himself with the same analytical attention he brought to any subject, trying to see clearly, to record accurately, to understand through the act of representation. The results are not flattering. He painted himself as he was, or as he saw himself to be, without the idealization that commissioned portraits typically required. The face that appears is weathered, intense, sometimes haggard, marked by the difficulties of his life. These are not images designed to please but documents of honest observation, records of what the mirror showed a man willing to look. The still life paintings, particularly the flower pieces, demonstrate another aspect of Vincent's achievement. He painted flowers throughout his career but with particular concentration during certain periods, notably the Sunflower series in Auvers and various flower studies in Paris and Saint-Rémy. These paintings might seem simple, arrangements of blossoms in vases, conventional subjects that countless painters had attempted. But Vincent transformed the genre through intensity of color, and the same directional brushwork that characterized his other mature paintings. The sunflowers in their yellow vases against yellow backgrounds achieved an almost hallucinatory saturation, the single color explored through infinite variations of hue and value. The flower paintings also reveal Vincent's working method more clearly than more complex compositions. He worked quickly, often completing a canvas in a single session, while the flowers remained fresh. This speed required confidence and decision, no time for second thoughts or careful revision. The results show a painter fully in command of his means, able to translate observation into paint with an efficiency that belied the apparent roughness of the surfaces. What looked spontaneous was actually the product of years of practice, the development of skills that allowed rapid execution without sacrifice of quality. Landscape remained Vincent's most consistent subject across all periods of his work. From the early drawings of Dutch countryside through the Provençal fields and orchards to the final views around Auvers, he returned again and again to the depiction of land, sky, and the human marks upon them. These landscapes were never merely scenic. Vincent painted working land, fields under cultivation, orchards in production, roads and bridges that served practical purposes. The human presence was always implied even when no figures appeared, the landscape shaped by labor, and used rather than preserved as wilderness. The seasonal cycle structured much of his landscape work. He painted the same locations at different times of year, tracking the changes that weather and growth produced. The orchards around Auvers appeared in blossom, in leaf, and after harvest. The wheat field showed the progression from green shoots through golden ripeness to stubble. This attention to temporal change connected Vincent to older traditions of landscape painting, to the cycles of the agricultural year that had organized rural life for millennia. His modern technique rendered ancient subjects, bridging the innovations of contemporary art and the enduring patterns of existence on the land. The question of Vincent's mental illness and its relationship to his art has occupied observers since his death. The dramatic episodes, the severed ear, the asylum confinement, the probable suicide, provided irresistible material for those who wished to connect creativity with madness. The Romantic tradition, stretching back through the 19th century and beyond, held that genius and instability were linked, that the capacity to see what others could not required a loosening of ordinary mental constraints. Vincent's biography seemed to confirm this tradition, offering a case study in artistic vision purchased at the cost of sanity. The medical reality was more complicated than the mythology allowed. Vincent experienced distinct episodes of acute crisis, periods lasting days or weeks during which he was incapacitated, confused, and sometimes dangerous to himself. These episodes were separated by longer periods of relative stability during which he worked productively, corresponded lucidly, and managed the practical details of daily life. The pattern suggested an episodic condition, something that came and went rather than a continuous state of derangement. Between attacks, he was capable of sustained concentration, careful observation, and rational decision-making. The hundreds of paintings and thousands of letters he produced testified to a mind that functioned effectively most of the time. Modern attempts to diagnose Vincent retrospectively have proposed numerous possibilities. Bipolar disorder, with its alternation between manic and depressive states, fits some aspects of the evidence. Temporal lobe epilepsy, which can produce altered perceptions and emotional disturbances, has attracted support from neurologists. Acute intermittent porphyria, a metabolic disorder that can cause psychiatric symptoms, has been suggested based on certain physical complaints Vincent mentioned. The effects of absinthe, the wormwood-flavored alcohol he consumed heavily during his time in France, may have contributed to his symptoms. Lead poisoning from paint pigments has been proposed. Combinations of multiple factors seem most likely: a vulnerable constitution stressed by poor nutrition, excessive alcohol, overwork, and emotional turmoil. Whatever the underlying condition, Vincent understood that he was ill and sought both to manage his symptoms and to work around them. His voluntary admission to Saint-Rémy reflected recognition that he needed supervision and structure to prevent harm to himself. His correspondence during the asylum period showed awareness of his condition, attempts to understand its patterns, and determination to continue working despite its interruptions. He distinguished between the periods of crisis, which he experienced as overwhelming and incomprehensible, and his normal state, which he considered fundamentally sound. He did not embrace madness as a source of vision but treated it as an obstacle to overcome, an enemy of the sustained effort that serious painting required. The paintings produced during and immediately after episodes of crisis show no obvious signs of derangement. The Saint-Rémy works, created in an asylum surrounded by severely disturbed patients, are among Vincent's most controlled and deliberate. The Starry Night, painted while under medical supervision, demonstrates sophisticated compositional planning and careful color orchestration. The Auvers paintings, created in the final weeks of his life when whatever pressures drove him toward death were presumably intensifying, maintain the technical quality and observational precision of his best work. If madness contributed to his vision, it did so in ways that left no direct trace on the canvases. More plausible is the suggestion that Vincent's temperament, quite apart from his episodic illness, contributed to his artistic character. He was intense, obsessive, prone to extremes of enthusiasm and disappointment. He formed attachments quickly and deeply, investing relationships with expectations they could not sustain. He worked compulsively, unable to moderate his output even when exhaustion threatened his health. These personality traits, present throughout his adult life and not limited to periods of crisis, shaped his approach to painting. The visible effort in his brushwork, the emotional saturation of his color, the relentless productivity that poured out hundreds of paintings in a few years, all reflected a temperament wound tighter than most could tolerate. This temperament was both asset and liability. It provided the energy and dedication that allowed Vincent to transform himself from untrained beginner to original master in less than a decade. It drove him to work when others would have rested, to push through difficulties that would have discouraged more balanced personalities. But it also created the interpersonal conflicts that isolated him, the domestic failures that left him alone, the inability to modulate his behavior according to social expectations. The same intensity that powered his art made ordinary life difficult and may have contributed to whatever desperation ended it. The relationship between Vincent and Theo, central to his life and work, deserves consideration as something more than simple patronage. Theo did not merely pay the bills while Vincent painted. He served as audience, critic, confidant, and collaborator in a shared project that both brothers understood as their joint enterprise. The monthly allowance was not charity but investment, an arrangement that would eventually repay Theo through ownership of the works his support made possible. Vincent sent paintings to Paris with the expectation that Theo would evaluate them, store them, show them, and eventually sell them. The brothers discussed prices, markets, and strategies for building reputation. Their correspondence constituted a continuous dialogue about art and its place in the world. Theo's own position was complicated. He worked for Bussard, Valadon and Company, successors to the Goupil firm where both brothers had begun their careers. His job required him to sell paintings that would return profit to his employers, primarily academic and salon-approved work that commanded reliable prices. His personal sympathies lay with the Impressionists and their successors, artists whose commercial prospects were uncertain and whose work his superiors viewed with skepticism. He managed to build a private trade in independent art alongside his official duties, cultivating collectors who trusted his judgment, and acquiring works by Monet, Degas, Gauguin, and others for clients willing to take risks. Vincent's paintings fit into this side business, works that Theo believed in but could not openly promote through official channels. The strain of this double life, combined with responsibility for Vincent, and eventually for his own family, wore on Theo's health and spirits. His letters reveal exhaustion, frustration, and periodic despair about his situation. He loved his brother and believed in his talent, but also resented the burden that supporting him imposed. He hoped for commercial breakthrough that would validate their joint sacrifice but saw little evidence that the market would accept Vincent's work in time to relieve immediate pressures. When Vincent died, Theo lost not only a brother but a purpose that had organized years of his life. His rapid decline afterwards suggested that the purpose had been sustaining him more than he knew. Johanna van Gogh Bonger, who entered the family only in 1889 through her marriage to Theo, became the crucial figure in establishing Vincent's posthumous reputation. She was not an art professional, had no prior experience with the complexities of the market, and found herself widowed with an infant and hundreds of unsold paintings within 18 months of her marriage. What she did have was intelligence, determination, and genuine appreciation for her brother-in-law's work developed through reading his letters and living with his paintings. She recognized that she possessed not merely an inheritance but a responsibility, an obligation to ensure that the sacrifices of both brothers achieved the recognition they deserved. Her strategy combined careful management with selective revelation. She did not flood the market with works but released them gradually, building demand while maintaining prices. She loaned important paintings to exhibitions that would enhance Vincent's visibility among critics and collectors. She cultivated relationships with dealers who could place works in significant collections. And she prepared the letters for publication, understanding that the personal narrative they contained would create emotional connection between viewers and the paintings they accompanied. The letters proved at least as important as the paintings in establishing Vincent's place in cultural memory. They provided what the paintings alone could not: a story with a protagonist, a narrative arc, a human being whose struggles and aspirations readers could recognize and sympathize with. The suffering artist, the misunderstood genius, the flame that burned too brightly, these archetypes gained specificity through Vincent's own words. He became not just a painter but a character, someone whose life could be told and retold, adapted and dramatized, reduced to essential elements that resonated across cultures and generations. The accuracy of this characterization mattered less than its power. Vincent as he actually lived, difficult, demanding, often his own worst enemy, gave way to Vincent as cultural symbol, the pure artist sacrificed on the altar of Philistine indifference. The transformation was not exactly false, elements of the myth derived from genuine aspects of his experience, but it was selective, emphasizing what fit the narrative while minimizing what complicated it. The years of failed careers before he became an artist, the treatment of Sean and other women, the conflicts with family and friends that reflected his own limitations as much as others' failures to understand him, these aspects of the record faded in popular accounts while the suffering and the dedication enlarged. The paintings themselves, independent of the mythology, continued to work on viewers who knew nothing of the biography. Museums that acquired Van Gogh canvases found them among the most popular items in their collections, drawing crowds who might pass quickly by other masterpieces. The sunflowers and starry nights became visual landmarks, images so widely reproduced that even people who had never entered a museum recognized them. This popularity sometimes provoked condescension from those who prized difficulty and obscurity in art, who suspected that what appealed to millions must lack the complexity that serious work required. But the popularity persisted, resistant to critical fashion, renewed with each generation that encountered the paintings fresh. The accessibility of Vincent's work derived partly from its apparent directness. The paintings seemed to offer immediate emotional communication without requiring specialized knowledge or trained perception. A viewer could stand before the sunflowers and feel something, could respond to the yellow intensity without understanding color theory or knowing anything about post-impressionism. This directness was somewhat illusory, the product of sophisticated technique that concealed its own operations, but the illusion was effective. The paintings welcomed viewers rather than excluding them, offering entry points that more cerebral work denied. The subjects contributed to this accessibility. Vincent painted things that ordinary people recognized and cared about, flowers and fields and faces rather than classical mythology or aristocratic display. His peasants and postmen, his bedrooms and cafes, belonged to a world that modern viewers could imagine inhabiting. The landscapes, while specifically Provençal or Dutch, evoked universal experiences of nature and season. Even viewers who had never seen a cypress tree or a wheat field under a troubled sky could respond to the emotional tenor of Vincent's depictions, the way he made familiar subjects carry unfamiliar weight. The technique that seemed so radical in its own time came to appear almost traditional against the developments that followed. Compared to Cubist fragmentation, surrealist fantasy, or abstract expressionist rejection of representation, Vincent's paintings looked almost conventional, landscapes and portraits that could be recognized as such, subjects that remained identifiable beneath the expressive handling. This relative accessibility made him a comfortable entry point into modern art for audiences intimidated by more extreme departures from tradition. Museums could present him as a bridge between the old masters and the bewildering present, an artist who maintained connection to representation while pushing toward expression. The commercial dimensions of Van Gogh's posthumous existence grew increasingly elaborate as the 20th century advanced. The scarcity of authentic works, roughly 900 paintings and over 1,000 drawings, ensured that those available commanded premium prices. Authentication became crucial and contested, with experts disagreeing about attributions and catalogs requiring periodic revision. Forgeries appeared, some crude and quickly detected, others sophisticated enough to deceive knowledgeable buyers. The stakes were high enough that lawsuits, scandals, and scholarly disputes became regular features of the Van Gogh market. The reproduction industry that grew around his images generated revenues far exceeding the value of original paintings. Sunflowers and starry nights appeared on posters, calendars, coffee mugs, umbrellas, and countless other commercial products. The Van Gogh Museum licensed images carefully, attempting to maintain some control over how the paintings were used while generating income that supported scholarship and conservation. The artist who sold one painting during his lifetime became one of the most commercially exploited figures in cultural history, his images circulating through economies he could not have imagined. This commercial success produced ambivalent responses. Some celebrated the democratization of access, the ability of people who could never afford originals or visit distant museums to live with reproductions that brought something of Vincent's vision into ordinary spaces. Others lamented the degradation of art into merchandise, the reduction of complex visual experiences to decorative commodities. The paintings themselves remained in museums and private collections, protected and preserved, while their images proliferated beyond any possibility of control. Vincent had wanted his work to reach common people, to communicate beyond the elite audiences of galleries and salons. Whether the reproduction industry fulfilled or betrayed this aspiration remained an open question. Scholarly attention to Vincent intensified throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. Art historians examined his technique through scientific analysis, studying the chemistry of his pigments, the structure of his brushwork, the changes his paintings underwent over time. The fading of certain colors, particularly the red lake pigments that shifted toward blue, altered the appearance of works that had looked quite different when first painted. Conservation efforts attempted to stabilize deteriorating surfaces while respecting the physical evidence of original creation. Each major painting became an object of technical study as well as aesthetic appreciation. The letters received similarly intensive treatment. The complete scholarly edition published in 2009 presented all surviving correspondence with extensive annotation, contextual essays, and reproductions of sketches Vincent included in his letters. Digital versions made the archive searchable and accessible worldwide. Readers could now encounter Vincent's own words with a completeness that earlier editions had not provided, following his thoughts through thousands of pages that documented nearly every aspect of his adult life. The letters confirmed his intelligence, his learning, his capacity for sustained reflection, complicating the image of untutored genius that popular accounts sometimes promoted. Biographical research continued to uncover new information and revise old assumptions. The circumstances of Vincent's death received particular scrutiny, with some scholars arguing that the traditional suicide narrative rested on thin evidence and contradicted aspects of his final weeks. The alternative theory, that he was shot accidentally or deliberately by others and chose not to implicate them, could not be definitively proven but could not be dismissed either. Other aspects of the biography underwent similar re-examination: relationships with women, the extent of his mental illness, the nature of his religious beliefs, each topic generating scholarly literature and competing interpretations. The cultural status Vincent achieved by the late 20th century placed him among the most recognized artists in global consciousness. Surveys of popular opinion consistently ranked him among the best-known painters, often ahead of figures whose technical accomplishments or historical importance might seem greater. The Yellow House in Auvers became a pilgrimage site despite having been destroyed during World War II. The café he painted on the Place du Forum reconstructed its appearance to match the famous canvas, blurring the line between historical site and themed attraction. Auvers was similarly traded on its Van Gogh connection, directing tourists to his grave and the locations of his final paintings. This cultural presence extended far beyond the Western world where Vincent had lived and worked. Japanese collectors acquired major paintings, and exhibitions in Japan drew enormous crowds. Chinese audiences discovered Van Gogh through reproductions and digital media, responding to images created by a Dutchman painting French landscapes in a visual language that crossed cultural boundaries. The universality that Vincent had sometimes claimed for art, its capacity to communicate across the particular circumstances of its creation, seemed vindicated by this global reception. Whatever he had expressed in paint proved translatable, accessible to viewers whose experience differed profoundly from his own. The influence Vincent exerted on subsequent art remained a matter of ongoing assessment. The direct lines of descent, from his expressive color to fauvism, from his emotional intensity to expressionism, were well established and widely acknowledged. More diffuse influences were harder to trace but potentially more significant. The idea that paintings should express personal vision rather than reproduce appearances, that technical skills served larger purposes than mere accuracy, that the artist's emotional state could properly inform the work, these assumptions became so embedded in modern and contemporary practice that their origins grew invisible. Vincent did not invent these ideas. They had roots in Romanticism and developed through many channels, but he embodied them so completely that his example reinforced their authority. The dangers of his example were less often noted. young artists who took from Vincent permission to paint badly in pursuit of authenticity, who confused crudeness with sincerity, who expected suffering to substitute for discipline, learned the wrong lessons from his career. Vincent had worked for years to develop his skills, had studied masters and contemporaries, had practiced techniques systematically before achieving the apparent spontaneity of his mature style. The paintings that looked unfinished or rough were the products of deliberate choice, not inability. Artists who skipped the preparation and expected comparable results misunderstood what they were imitating. The enduring power of Vincent van Gogh's achievement rested finally on the paintings themselves, on what they offered viewers who stood before them in museums and galleries around the world. The biography provided context, the letters offered explanation, the scholarship traced influences and techniques. But the paintings remained primary, the reason for all the attention that surrounded them. They worked on viewers directly, through color and form and the accumulated evidence of their making, communicating something that words could approach but not replace. What they communicated defied simple summary. The paintings were not illustrations of ideas or expressions of doctrines. They did not argue for positions or advance programs. They presented appearances, things seen and transformed through seeing, offered to viewers as occasions for their own perception. A wheat field became more than a wheat field, not by representing something else but by being more fully itself, rendered with an intensity that revealed what ordinary seeing overlooked. The cypress trees, the starry nights, the sunflowers in their vases, each took on a presence that exceeded its subject, that made the familiar strange and the strange somehow recognizable. This capacity to transform appearance through attention was Vincent's fundamental gift. He looked at things with an intensity that most people cannot sustain, that most painters do not achieve, and he found ways to translate that looking into paint. The translation was never literal, never simply a record of optical data. It involved selection and emphasis, decisions about what mattered and how to show it. The brushstrokes that followed contours, the colors pushed beyond natural appearance, the compositions that organized experience into graspable form, all represented interventions between seeing and showing. But the interventions served seeing, made it shareable, extended to viewers the possibility of perception they might not have reached alone. The work continued to speak after the circumstances of its creation had faded into history. The specific locations Vincent painted, the people he knew, the events of his life, all receded as the paintings moved into collections and consciousness far removed from late 19th century France and the Netherlands. What remained was the visual experience itself, the encounter between viewer and canvas that renewed itself with each looking. The paintings did not require knowledge of their origins to produce their effects. They met viewers where they stood, in whatever state of preparation or ignorance, and offered what they had to give. This independence from context distinguished art from other forms of historical evidence. A letter required understanding of language and circumstances to yield its meaning. A biography depended on knowing who the subject was and why their life mattered. But a painting could work on viewers who knew nothing at all, who simply walked into a gallery and found themselves stopped before a canvas they had never seen. The stopping, the arrest of ordinary attention, the shift into a different mode of perception, happened before interpretation began. Knowledge could deepen the experience but could not create it. The painting had to do that work itself. Vincent's paintings did that work with unusual consistency. They stopped people, held them, invited extended looking that casual gallery visits rarely sustained. The surfaces rewarded scrutiny, revealing more as the eye moved across them, discovering relationships and details that quick glances missed. The color harmonies set up resonances that developed over time, complementary contrasts vibrating into awareness, subtle variations within dominant hues emerging as the eye adjusted. The directional brushwork created rhythms that the eye followed almost involuntarily, guided through compositions that were more structured than they first appeared. The emotional tone of this experience varied with the painting and the viewer. Some canvases produced exhilaration, the sunflowers and blossoming orchards generating responses of pleasure and vitality. Others induced melancholy, the night scenes and asylum corridors touching darker registers of feeling. Still others achieved a kind of equilibrium, the portraits and still lives resting in observation without pushing toward extreme states. The range of emotional content was broader than the mythology of suffering genius suggested. Vincent painted joy and calm as well as anguish, recorded satisfactions as well as struggles. His sensibility was not monochrome but varied, responsive to different subjects and different moments. The self-portraits, spanning his entire mature career, documented this variability with particular clarity. The face that appeared across more than 40 canvases was not always haggard or tormented. Sometimes it was merely observant, recording appearances without editorial comment. Sometimes it showed determination, the set jaw of a man committed to his work regardless of obstacles. Sometimes it revealed exhaustion, the cost of sustained effort and uncertain health. And sometimes, rarely but unmistakably, it showed something like contentment, a painter satisfied with what he was accomplishing, at peace for the moment with his circumstances. These images complicated the narrative of unrelenting suffering, showing a man who experienced life's full range even as he struggled with forces that would eventually overwhelm him. The letters, read alongside the paintings, revealed a mind of considerable sophistication working through problems that engaged the best artists of his generation. Vincent thought seriously about color and its effects, about the relationship between observation and invention, about the social purposes art might serve and the formal means it might employ. He was not a theorist in any systematic sense, did not produce manifestos or doctrinal statements, but he was an intelligent practitioner who reflected on what he was doing and why. The apparent spontaneity of his paintings coexisted with deliberate thought, the two aspects of his practice informing each other rather than standing in opposition. His ambitions for art remained rooted in human connection. He wanted to paint in ways that would reach ordinary people, that would communicate across the barriers of education and class that separated artists from potential audiences. This democratic impulse conflicted with the realities of the art market, which directed paintings toward wealthy collectors and prestigious institutions rather than the common viewers Vincent imagined. The posthumous fame that made his images ubiquitous achieved something like his goal, putting Van Gogh reproductions in dormitory rooms and modest homes where original paintings would never hang. Whether these reproductions delivered what the originals offered, whether mechanical reproduction could transmit what direct encounter provided, remained questions that the reproduction industry preferred not to examine. The 10 years of Vincent's artistic career, from the tentative beginnings in the Borinage through the final burst of productivity in Auvers, represented an acceleration of development that had few parallels in art history. He began essentially from nothing, with no formal training, no technical foundation, no clear sense of what kind of artist he might become. He ended having produced a body of work that would hang in major museums worldwide, that would influence generations of subsequent painters, that would enter the permanent visual vocabulary of modern culture. The transformation happened through relentless labor, through willingness to fail and learn from failure, through absorption of every influence he encountered and synthesis of those influences into something genuinely new. The cost of this achievement registered in his health, his relationships, and finally his life. The intensity that powered his art also destabilized his existence, pushing him beyond what mind and body could sustain. The breakdowns that punctuated his final years represented the limit of what he could demand from himself, the point where determination collided with incapacity. Whether his death at 37 represented suicide, accident, or something more ambiguous, it ended a trajectory that could not have continued indefinitely. The work he left behind had to stand for whatever more he might have accomplished, had circumstances been different, had his constitution been stronger, had fortune treated him more kindly. What the work offered, finally, was a model of attention, a demonstration of what looking could become when pursued with absolute commitment. Vincent saw the world with an intensity that transformed what he saw, not into something false but into something more fully present, more visually complete, than ordinary perception achieved. The paintings preserved this seeing, made it available to viewers willing to slow down and look. They did not require agreement with Vincent's ideas or sympathy with his struggles. They required only eyes and willingness to use them, openness to visual experience that might exceed expectation. The man who made these paintings remained a figure of contradictions, brilliant and difficult, generous and demanding, capable of both profound insight and damaging blindness. He was not a saint or a hero but a human being of unusual capacities and unusual limitations. The mythology that grew up around him simplified these complexities, reducing a full life to a few dramatic moments, a few famous images, a narrative arc that satisfied desire for meaning more than it respected historical reality. The paintings offered something different, not a story but an experience, not a moral but an encounter. They waited in museums and collections around the world, patient and permanent, ready to meet whoever came to look at them. Vincent had written to Theo, in one of the hundreds of letters that documented his thinking, that he wanted his work to speak to generations he would never see, to communicate across the gulf that separated present from future. This hope, expressed by a man whose contemporaries largely ignored or rejected what he made, seemed almost delusional at the time. A century and more later, it no longer seemed delusional at all. The paintings spoke. They continued to speak. They would continue as long as there were eyes to see them and minds capable of responding to what they showed. The misunderstood genius had made himself understood, not through explanation or advocacy but through the work itself, through the accumulated evidence of what devoted attention could discover and devoted labor could create.